When Mark asked me to take part in this talk, I think he framed it as he wanted to be a little bit provocative, or that was how I interpreted the invitation. So I kind of dug back into my early postgraduate degree when I did a diploma in history and philosophy of science, where everyone used to write really cheeky, kind of provocative abstracts and then make stuff up as they were getting towards presentation. So this is kind of a 20 years ago feeling about this in terms of what I'm actually presenting. And whereas Stephen has presented something which is quite empirically oriented, I took the provocation to think about really the nature of social science expertise and the politics of expertise in a situation where obviously social science has great relevance, but for those who are working in this domain, do not necessarily feel like we're much loved by those who have power to fund it or indeed to have impact upon how the world actually is. So with that, I'll try and advance slides. Yeah. So you probably have noticed, and this is obviously cognizant with what Stephen was talking about, and indeed with the Drugs Don't Work report, and indeed any number of different reports that you might read from one of the sort of large international bodies, whether it's WHO, the FAO, or the OIE, or the sort of now it's known as the World Organization of Animal Health, where the social sciences are really sort of pulled out and put on this pedestal and said they're key to resolving the issues of One Health policymaking and AMR in particular. And if you go to various conferences or you hang out with people who work in policy worlds or indeed clinically or as epidemiologically, they will say that inherent socialness of the problem in AMR is evident to everybody. So as someone who spent the best part of a decade going to very large meetings with One Health collaboration as it sort of gained momentum from 2008 onwards, and the size of these auditoriums was increasing and the power of the people in the room was also becoming more evident as more and more sort of superluminary figures from global health or infectious disease world would be there as keynotes. You got the sense that you are really kind of becoming as a social scientist or indeed a bioethicist, there wasn't really you were talked about, but you weren't really talked to very much, if that makes sense. You were sort of this abstract entity that existed out there in the world. And instead, the real focus seemed to be on these things, which are phylogenetic maps. And the evolution of pathogenomics and the use of these technologies can be tracked quite clearly from a period of about 20 years. And if you sort of do the Latourian work of what are we actually looking at here and kind of abstract yourself from knowledge of how this is created, you could see the sort of transition and the use of phylogenetic maps became much more comparative throughout the decade that I was attending these things. And then people would start to do different types of circles with them, and then they would like link them on a map and make all of these kind of observations. So there was this real sort of reductiveness around how they were thinking about One Health and One Health as a set of problems, as a very sort of biomedical model to it, even as they talked about the sociality of it. And then there came a point where they started to do these types of things and they actually put animals in their diagrams, but they segregated these animals to the extent that there wasn't any much sociality there. It was really a feeling that these things were obviously sort of siloed or uniquely species specific, even though we know that that's the exact reason why we were looking at them, was their transmissibility and the ability for spillover. But it was kind of not necessarily something that you felt like the social was missing. It wasn't really understood in those terms, a very reductive sense about your experience. So rather than being on the stage or being in the front row or being in the conversation, you were kind of in the back on the left and listening, and they would be saying, we need to talk to the social science about this, of course, we really need social science. And then they wouldn't have a plenary who was a social scientist, or they wouldn't have any real engagement with social science beyond the acknowledgement that it was somehow important. So then you looked at how the money was coming from with these very large events, and then you saw that the funders were majorly pharmaceutical companies who have interests in sort of very immediate technological solutions to these things, which don't require large systemic change. And you begin to come a little bit kind of, well, this is a bit paranoid, whatever, and maybe I'm becoming a little bit more tin hatty about this. And then with COVID coming in, and you see these types of things was constructed quite early in the pandemic around all of the known phylogenies of coronaviruses, and there's something quite extraordinary amount of data points in that, so maximum data. And the focus of One Health, the conferences that I'd been through, which was very much about stamp collecting and finding every virus and virus hunting and knowing all the viruses with some notion of prediction, didn't predict coronavirus. And the same people who are listening to these people about these types of predictions and their inability to predict them also thought that this was a great campaign to drive vaccination for people who had coronavirus at a time when the vaccines weren't necessarily available in Australia. And they also didn't predict this, which was obviously a bit more back to the tin hatness that came out as a notion of how expertise has been diluted and how our shared world of facts, if you want to have it in any other description, is now sort of being fragmented through erosions of expertise, erosions of judgments, and erosions of trust. So that experience and then Mark's invitation kind of led me to do a little bit of work around how this problem has been thought of in the past in Australia. And the Social Science Academy of Australia in 2004 published a white paper led by Meredith Edwards, and she conceptualized the issue of why social sciences really aren't entering into public policy in Australia in any significant way. So this is not this is not a very new problem. It's obviously quite a long-standing problem in a supply side and demand side dichotomy, as in the two sides of the coin between people who make decisions and social scientists, as it were. And if you look at that list, those of us who work in the social sciences will see that actually quite a lot of this is just very much the same. There's a public goods problem in terms of the adequacy of funding to do the type of work that we're asked to do. There's problems of access to research data in that regard. Policy comprehension and among researchers is also an issue. Communication problems still in terms of terminologies and understanding what each other are talking about is also still an issue. And then on the demand side, perhaps that's not quite the case. I think there's a greater awareness among politicians and bureaucrats, or when you say policy actors perhaps, that policy needs to be evidence-driven, or at least needs to look like it's evidence-driven. And that, again, is another issue around the artifices of politics. But you might also see that some of those things are relevant. So with that in mind, I kind of sat down and then I wrote that abstract. And then I promised to provide three things and a kind of set of solutions potentially, which is a little bit more conceptual perhaps. But this is very protean and formative, and so forgive me for any sins, they're all mine in how I'm thinking about this. But I think there are three fundamental causes, and Stephen sort of spoke a little bit about these towards the end of his discussion with the conclusions that he drew. And I'll let you just have a quick look at them, but in short, there's a persistence of aggregative logics in how people think about these issues in terms of both socialness and otherwise. Within those who work within a clinical sphere or a public health sphere or an epidemiological sphere in AMR, they still have quite a strong commitment to positivism in the sense that they don't necessarily easily recognize that facts and values are quite intertangled in many situations. And then there's the actual problem of social science itself and the nature of the objects of study that social science looks at. And having epistemic authority of social phenomena is something that everybody has, not necessarily just social scientists. So we have this problem where epistemic authority in social science is not easily protected. We don't have an ability to have strong boundary work around that if we work as social scientists in these fields. So I'll give a little riff on each of these just to provide a little bit more depth. So if you look at the population health sciences, and indeed you look at most biomedical sciences, then they like to trust numbers, and there's an enumerative capacity or logic within it where more numbers are better and counting things is more trustworthy than a subjective measure in many ways. And there's also a reductiveness about it. So the way to understand things is not necessarily to look at wholes, but to break things down into parts and then understand the relationships through those parts. If you can get the double whammy of being able to break things into parts and then count those things that you've broken into parts and make claims, then you're kind of on your way to getting quite a good kind of set of objective facts about phenomena. So when you abstract up to those population-based sciences in health, which are epidemiology, health economics, they tend to make their assertions on aggregations and analysis of these types of data. So they don't necessarily look at complexity or relationships between individuals as such. They just like to count and think in those types of ways. And this way of constituting populations implies that the characteristics of those populations are determined by the intrinsic essence of their component parts. So it's the sense that there's not more, there's no value add in knowing more about how the whole thing sits together, because my mind is scraping for that expression, but there's not more to it than what you can count or what you can break it up into, which obviously has implications for how we think and understand what's happening in social phenomena. If the people who are making assessments about what types of evidence are necessary and the relevance of such come with this set of assumptions driving their engagement with the types of expertise and types of data and types of information that are produced. Then there's sort of a recursive effect within that is basically that the aggregated data constitutes population, then tends to transfer knowledge about groups from within society. So we then start to have sort of more lumping together which means that rather than understanding the complexity within group or relationships between groups that we're looking at, it tends to sort of homogenize across groups, if that makes sense, so that you within group, I should say, so that you get these sort of really simplistic but quite banal sort of oversights and statements, which then tend to drive how people think about and respond to social phenomena when they're trying to think of what types of actions to take. And this does very little to capture the role and dynamic interactions between individuals and complex systems, which we start to think of in environments and the social. So this has implications for the types of knowledge which are used going forward, because they don't tend to see that as having a type of intrinsic value. Overlapping this is the problem with harder sciences and a sort of a reluctance to let go of the idea that you can have a really hard and bright line between facts and values. In this way of thinking about this, because obviously values shape how we respond. We kind of respond to the social phenomena around us, both behaviorally and also through the values that we have and the commitments that we have. And in this sense, then values become merely subjective. They're just matters of opinion and interpretation, taste, inclination. So they're really something that can't necessarily be pinned down or quantified or objectively measured. Becomes a difficult way to think about what you're looking at in terms of how its relationship with what people do and how it interacts with the social world is driven not necessarily just by how you can measure it in a simple way. It's not necessarily a rational enterprise. It's also something which has a much more sort of orientation around ideology and inclination towards certain types of beliefs, practices, and ways of being in the world. And this also then leads to the, I guess you could think of as a denial of something, which means that in terms of how I was trained, and perhaps I'm a little bit more on the constructivist side than others, but you can't necessarily say that there are social facts that are out there in the objective world, but they're all sort of historically and socially mediated. So there's no real way to disenchant them in the sense that objective science and positivism would want us to in that regard. All observation is value laden. So even the most scientific disciplines are affected by values, but even though they tend to deny this, and the practices by the norms of the professional groups. And what we end up with then, if this is not necessarily confined to the harder sciences, obviously sociology went through a phase, and there is still some films of social science which rely on some form of positivism, where you think about large-scale surveys looking for patterns and regularities. But this objectivity trap in how you think about the world still tends to be the way in which social sciences are easily discounted or put down. The latter of sort of the evidence that we need to do something about this because it's not necessarily consistent or relatable to the world that we look into. And these are the types of evidences that are favored by decision makers, those which have larger scale samples or sort of more of a focus on regularities and patterns in the way things occur. And then there's the final thing, and I'm drawing here very explicitly on a recent publication in Public Understanding of Science, led by Jamie Lewis, which was quite interesting in the way that it actually framed this notion of epistemic authority in social science. And if you think about what we claim to be able to do as social scientists, those of us who are in this meeting who have that hat, whether rightly or wrongly, everybody has the capacity to make claims about how the world works and social phenomena. It's something that we do all the time. It's not necessarily something that was restricted to our particular expertise or our particular discipline in that way. So even though we're intrinsically entangled and we have this knowledge of how publics work and how people know things about publics and how people know things about public interest and how you might engage with that in a scholarly way, that's not necessarily how our expertise is thought of by other disciplines. There's a way in which we basically seem to have a little bit more knowledge, perhaps, about how society works and how social phenomena work, but we have very porous boundaries around the discipline because there's rarely a research question which does not intersect in some way with the expertise and experience of publics, or it's not necessarily something which decision makers don't think that they have a value add or an opinion about. And this kind of starks in sort of stark contrast to the hard boundary work that goes around biosciences, medicine, and medical population sciences, where they do very, very hard work around the types of expertise which are allowed to call themselves or have opinions about the types of knowledge and information that they produce. And they exclude variant forms of expertise quite clinically, for want of a better description. Whereas this respect is not necessarily extended to social scientists, because people live in the world, people have a social life, people have experiences of sociality. So there's a sense in which they think they know enough to be able to form judgments, which doesn't necessarily correspond to the types of, so I guess it's that really idea of dissembling or diffusion, where it's very hard to argue against someone who knows something because they know it, because it's a social world in which they've inhabited and they have experience of in that way. And this then feeds in, obviously, within the broader politicization and delegitimization of expertise by decision makers and publics. Happens much more easily in social sciences. It's much easier to say that's just your opinion. And therefore, the claims that knowledge and insight that social scientists might have are more easily dismissed and contested. So when I originally kind of knocked this up as a protein thing, I presented this at a sort of a in-center seminar where I'm going, I've got to give this talk. I'm kind of working out what I'm doing here. And I presented this diagram more as a process, so that it was like arrows going in either way, because I thought it was like a loop. And then that really annoyed two people who convinced me that it was more of a Venn diagram and I was being very nihilistic and I had to be careful. So in the attempt to avoid nihilism, I'll go back to Weber, and say that the impasse is actually to do with how we're becoming, there's a level of disenchantment about our inability to completely disenchant the world. So social science is left with this invidious position of not being able to match the standards or logics of evidence which are demanded by other disciplines. And then, even though they themselves admit that they can't clarify questions, so they can't answer necessarily all questions through science without the clarification. Sorry. you can may be able to clarify questions of values and morals which are implicit within how values are intrinsically related to facts, but you ultimately cannot answer them without a social science lens. You still need to do this in this way. You can't necessarily do it just through science itself. So I promised a couple of solutions, and I promised one, and then I've come up with 3 over the period. I've been involved in a couple of projects now where people who work in the policy world have floated this idea of creating a social science observatory, just because they don't have the expertise or time to engage with social scientists in their language, and they need policy briefs developed by social scientists which are produced, which then they can use in action in that way. So this is kind of having a sort of a mediating voice between the social science discipline itself and the policy world, which makes some sense. Solution 2 is to actually try and educate people more around how social science might have relevance within policy worlds and increase the disciplinary strength within that way. But again, that doesn't necessarily always work, because we know that there's still a gap in terms of education process and how that actually plays out further on. And then there is also a way in which we could potentially move forward from here, and is actually to use the disenchantment with disenchantment and the fact value distinction to do some work. So I think Stephen was pointing to this a little bit in the end towards his talk, and saying how these logics work in certain ways. And then you have really concrete examples. If you can produce concrete examples which enable people to see how values actually shape facts in a particular type of way, and then position the expertise of social science as being in a unique position to do that disentanglement and to explain how it all interacts, then it actually might necessarily increase the value of social science in the view of those who have the ability to take this information on and then make decisions which are much more reflective of the social world, rather than the evidence that they rely on to do so. So it's really, I guess, a case of becoming an activist as a social scientist and making your impact much more concrete in the way you do it. And then that would allow you then to do the type of boundary work is required to then actually stop being on the sidelines and a little bit more closer to the conversation. So again, I will stop there, and thanks for your attention.